Alexa.
Alexa, play Digger Digger.
Whoa.
I can't find the song Shake It Digger.
Say, Alexa.
Alexa, play Digger Digger.
Oh.
I can't find the song to Good Digger.
Alexa,
Alexa, play Street Talk.
Let him do it.
Alexa, play Digger Digger. Alexa, play Digger Digger.
Bobby, can you tell it to play Wheels?
You want
on
to
the
hear a station for porn detected. Porno, ringtone, hot chick, amateur, girl, porn,
No,
sexy.
No.
Pussy, anal, dildo, ringtone.
Alexa, stop.
I'm fascinated by stuff like this. When the veneer of technology and design falls away and what you're left with is a small landmine in the house of a small family. I love this video so much. This idea of a small child having this like beautiful, touching experience, which is suddenly this tiny little landmine made by a or not even a Silicon Valley, it's a Seattle-based company, but made by a tech giant, suddenly explodes like a landmine in this kid's face, and I love it. It's just outrageous. Alexa, stop is such a dystopian thing to say, right? Like it's something that you wake up in the middle of a nightmare and you're like, oh my God, my Alexa was hunting me. So throughout my career, I've been really interested in moments like that. And these, as I said, are moments of design sort of falling away and revealing the ugly guts of the decisions that have been made underneath. And today I want to explore with you some of these ideas, and kind of deconstruct how something like that can happen, and sort of gain a bit of an understanding of the role of design, especially not just interface design, but also infrastructure design. And sort of, I want to show how we as a community are culpable for this kind of thing, and how we make excuses for it, and what we can do to make things better. But before I do that, I want to talk a little tiny bit about my career, because I think it helps to sort of frame what I'm talking about. So in the early 2010s, I was studying generative interfaces in music at university as a postgraduate degree in Melbourne, Australia. And as part of that work, I got a scholarship through the Apple Worldwide Developer Conference, and that gave me a ticket, I guess, after attending that conference, to this kind of Silicon Valley outsider position where I would, in the early days of the iPhone, so 2010, 2011, 2012, there was that gold rush, everybody remembers it, the idea that you could make several hundreds of thousands of dollars per month in just profit off the App Store. So I was involved in consulting as a designer. It's this weird kind of outsider, never really actually living there, always traveling back and forth. And while that was happening, there was like this weird thing happening in the world where we would hear about data leaks, we would hear about government surveillance, there's all of these sorts of hacks going on, which at the time seemed very abstract. But what I found as I moved both as a consultant and as an employee of consulting firms like big design firms was that we had this weird problem going on. So I'd be working with teams where we would openly mock clients, especially privately, not to their faces, but in particular, the problems that we were making fun of was that nothing was secure. This is an era before HTTPS was pushed as a standard for communication on the web. This is an era where it was you would have like unsecured WordPress installs or databases just sitting online. We still have that today, but then it was so much more prevalent. And the thing is that engineering teams knew about this. You had entire software development teams that had no security staff, but everybody knew that this stuff was insecure. And at the same time, we were meeting with clients, and we were getting briefs not just from clients but from our superiors. They were basically saying, let's build an interface, let's design an interface that the user can trust. We need to aesthetically and through user research and user experience design build these things that people trust, and we knew that that was a lie. So I got really upset about that and I quit. And in 2014 I prototyped Signal with Open Whisper systems. So Signal, if you know it, is a secure messaging app. And it's kind of weird when you see something that you've worked on show up in like House of Cards and stuff like that. But I mean, obviously this didn't, but this made it into beta. So what we were prototyping here was like, before WhatsApp had huge penetration, all these kinds of things, we were prototyping new ways of like designing beautiful InfoSec. At the time, I thought beautiful InfoSec would make this work really well. And beautiful InfoSec is not just about aesthetics, it's also about explaining choices to the user. So you have, in this case, for example, if you look at the settings screens that we devised, this is an example screen, so the information here is not actually accurate. But the idea here is that like you would explain choices to the user and make the choices that may adversely affect them really obvious to see and really obvious to understand. And this, of course, made it into beta, and then afterwards they went with a different direction. But I was really fascinated by this. I was interested in InfoSec design, so I started researching different ways in which people communicated and ways in which people have historically, throughout the ages, talked to each other in code, and how some of that code is easily readable and some of it isn't, but how they all share a role and they had these strengths and weaknesses around not just like compressing information and sending it long distances, but also in ways of like what you could do with that information. And then I got really into InfoSec design because I thought this was the way of the future. We would make everyone secure and everything would be safe. So I started working with SpiderOak, which is a cloud-based secure backup service. And we were at the time doing research with Carnegie Mellon around Web of Trust, this idea of can you trust people, sort of the other end of what Scuttlebutt sort of does with the idea of like the relationships between people and how you secure those, or how you trust those, and how you can confirm that people that you're talking to are the people that you actually know, and then things like that. So the problem was that at the time there was not as many role models as there are today around this kind of work. But even with these tools, we rolled out chat apps, we rolled out prototype anti-Twitter, which is like this idea of you're completely invisible until you choose to reveal your identity to someone, things like that. But the problem was that even though I was doing all of this work and we were putting stuff out in the public, bad stuff was still happening. You had Snowden leaks, you had the Ashley Madison hack, like huge, surprising, shocking things happening across not just government surveillance and things like that, but also like just rogue hackers and people with just varying ideologies. So what I realized is that like InfoSec wasn't actually the answer, and that the answer was actually potentially the issue was more fundamental than that. And so I joined Tactical Tech last year and moved to Berlin, and I started researching this concept that I call weaponized design. So weaponized design is a very, very specific thing, and that is interfaces and systems that harm users while performing entirely within their design. So, as an example, this is a snap map. It's a snap map made by Snapchat, and it was launched last year. And the idea is that when you snap, you share by default with a small opt-in screen at the very beginning, sort of pushing you towards actually sharing this information. You share your location with everybody on your contact list every time you snap. Now, as we know, Snapchat is wildly popular with teenage groups, or was, not so much anymore. But the idea was that you had a list of friends that you trusted, this is the assumption, and then from that you would share your information. And so what happened was that immediately after it launched, a reporter from The Verge managed to track one of her friends from a snap, just some random Snapchat snap, managed to track her directly to her front door and sent her a photo of her house on Google Maps and was like, hey, I just saw you snap, I know where you live. And her friend replied with this quote, basically absolutely shocked that something like that could happen. So how does this happen? How do you have someone who is interacting on a regular basis, heavy Snapchatters, people who understand this ecosystem, how do they get caught out by this? It turns out that Snapchat's idea, the design team in their thinking, considered only one real, or at least went with the solution that only considered your contact list as one type of person, someone that you trust. They inferred that you by default would trust the people that are in your contact list. But of course that's not true. This is some screenshots from one of the some of the more popular people on Snapchat. And of course, one of Snapchat's other big user bases are performers, sex workers who work online, or models and things like that, like people who have massive followings and huge amounts of engagement, but don't know and obviously don't trust the people who follow them, because it's impossible to do that. And of course, the worst thing about this example is that after this information was spread throughout these communities of users, especially these people who have a lot to lose by having their location revealed, in a subsequent update in the following week, the setting was turned back on by default. So, another example, very quickly, is this topic of abuse on Twitter, which we're going to talk a bit about today. And essentially, this is this outrageous idea that Twitter at one point decided that they were going to mute any notifications about being added to a list. Now, why would you want that? When you block someone on Twitter, they don't have the ability to contact you in any way, but what they can do is add you to a list. And when you are added to a list, you get a push notification about that. Or people who are their friends or like collaborators, if you're in that situation, can add you to a list, and you get a push notification that is very much unsolicited. And the idea here is that like what would happen is people who are targets of harassment would receive these list notifications that they were being added to horrendously named lists, and then these lists would push directly to your device, or the notification of this would be pushed to your device. And so Twitter was like, we'll just get rid of this feature altogether. But the problem is that people were using these lists as early warning mechanisms, like a pre-seismic activity indicator, that you were potentially about to receive a horde of abuse on Twitter, because what would happen is people, again, sometimes very public people, but not always, would see these list notifications and be able to do the preparation in anticipation of an onslaught of harassment from an online community. And this caused an outcry that was so intense that Twitter reversed that decision in like less than an hour. So this is weaponized design. Interfaces and systems that harm users whilst performing entirely within their design. It's important to note that this is not dark UX patterns, and also that it's not just about interface design. A dark UX pattern is where a design team designs for a decision that tries to push a user into making a choice that they wouldn't not otherwise make. And the example I got behind me here is this idea of trying to get people to sign up to loyalty card programs and burying the option to opt out deep within an area of the sign-up form that you wouldn't otherwise look at. So this is not what this is about. Instead, it's about design operating within the rules of the system that harms users. Weaponized design is also caused by the apolitical nature of a lot of discussion around design. So what I want to do now is go through a little bit of the history of design. And again, I'm talking very much from a design, like aesthetics and interface and user experience, but this is also true of infrastructure design. So, in 1993, Apple hired Donald Norman to work with the company, its early stage interaction team. So Donald Norman, this was an important hire. Silicon Valley already had like a number of these sorts of human-computer interaction teams in the works. IBM, Xerox, Apple themselves had the earlier ones, Microsoft did too. All of these people doing all of this work, especially on graphical user interfaces. But Donald Norman was really special because he was an associate professor at the psychology department of the University of California, and also a founder of the Institute of Cognitive Science. So like what happened was this person came and joined a team of researchers and artists and engineers who all formed the human-computer interactions team at Apple. And the team that was around that was extremely pivotal and made up of a number of different people, but Norman's role as a user experience designer marks a subtle but fundamental shift in the practice behind the design of what we now consider personal computing. Today, design teams don't really use this research, this background. You don't need a background in cognitive science or behavioral science, but a lot of the early learnings linger. Instead, what you have, like, design is more accessible than ever. You can study at university, you can do a master's, postgraduate, but you can also go to coding boot camps or design boot camps and become a designer from this. And this is really important because what's lacking across the board is this kind of depersonification or depersonalization of the design process. There's another reason why this happens. In 2000, this book comes out. It's called Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. And it takes the world by storm because it lands right at the end of around the time of the dot-com crash. So if everybody remembers, if you look at like aesthetics, like vaporwave picks up on this again, like in the mid 2010s and things like that. But the idea is that interfaces were convoluted and cluttered and difficult to understand. And before search engines, there were like web portals that had thousands of links and things like that. And so this book comes out, and it has like 3 central tenets to it. 1, don't make me think. 2, it doesn't matter how many times I have to click, as long as each click is a mindless, unambiguous choice. And 3, get rid of half the words on each page, then get rid of half of what's left. But you see, what this is implying in the broader thesis of this work is that we should design for a common cultural context. This idea that ultimately the role of a designer, both again in infrastructure, but from the infrastructure design team all the way through to the interface that people touch, every person in this process has to design and anticipate every single possible action of a person who's in that system, and then design obvious pathways for them to travel through. Designers who produce or adapt work for societies without a sturdy conceptual framework repeatedly fail their users. So even though this kind of context works in some cases, and we're going to talk about why it doesn't, it fails immediately in places like Japan and China, where typically Western companies have really struggled to gain footholds just simply based on the role of their interfaces and how they work. Different societies understand have different relationships to layout, for example, as a basic concept. And so you end up with these wildly different approaches to navigating information. But design in the West considers this to be like a universal property. And so repeatedly that had happened where the context of the cultural clash has led to basically companies in some cases going out of business. But the problem is, on a more general note, this is designernews.com, and this is a website that it's basically like the Hacker News of the design community. It even looks a lot like Hacker News. And the discourse in the popular discourse in the design community is based around trends and new frameworks and tools that you can use. It is a super apolitical, surface level area of design. This idea of focusing on delight, this sort of Steve Jobsification of interfaces and how stuff works, has led to this kind of fetishization of speed and animation and complexity being buried into these tiny devices, but without any kind of real understanding of the role in which these design plays. So let's talk about how weaponized design can occur. The most common way that this happens is literally through trade-off conflict. And what I mean by this is like where a design team goes through and makes a series of decisions, and either they make a trade-off. Design is always about a trade-off, but they either make a trade-off that that's deliberately prioritizing one set of users or another, or much more commonly that the trade-off is unconscious and it's based on unconscious biases that don't, and the design team doesn't fully understand the implications. So for this, I want to show you another video.
Okay, so we start a whole new account on Pinterest. We go and we want to learn about food and drink and art and, oh, who knows, what else? Gardening or something, maybe? Recipes. And we sign up. And look at this. This is nice. We get eggs, we get rice, we get balsamic pork chops. And I just want to know one thing. I'm looking for some information on vaccine reactions because I have a kid. going to get vaccinated, and this has a list of vaccine reactions. So let's save that to a board. We're just going to save that pin. We're not following anybody. But what we notice is after we do that, we have a lot of new stuff on our homepage here. And a lot of it's pretty scary about vaccines. And when we refresh it, it doesn't go away. Like embedded right there in the middle of a new couscous recipe is some stuff about autism. So we save our second pin. Our second pin is about autism. It's one of only 2 pins that we're going to save during this whole process. And you start to see what's happened already. Just by saving 2 pins, never explicitly asking for this stuff. Saving 2 pins, we're getting fluoride, conspiracy theories. We're getting stuff about GMO. We're branching out into like major medical conspiracies. And it gets even worse because one thing you might think is you start to see that it's getting pretty bad here. But what we might do is we might go and we might visit some of these pages. So we go and we visit a page to check and see if it's legitimate. It gets worse. Pinterest actually apparently regards that visiting the page as a sign of real interest in vaccination conspiracies. So when we come back to our page, when we come back to our front page, here's what it's like after we visit the page, right? You're starting to get to a point where the front page is almost all medical conspiracy. And again, this happens in the space of from signing up to about 14 minutes into having the Pinterest account. This is where we are. And I mean, look at this page. It's kind of amazing.
So the key part of trade-offs in this particular example is it can be traced to a single point that I think is a great example. It's a single example of a trade-off that a design team has made that completely wrecks this algorithm. So two parts of the company, the team building an algorithm and the team designing the interface, came together and decided that one click meant one thing. Clicking an item in your list equaled interest. And that's a trade-off for simplicity that, as you can see there, very quickly has profound effects. Let's look at some other examples. So you may have heard of the iCloud photo hack. This is an event that happens in which once iCloud rolled out, some people realized that you could just phish random people and then just find all of their photos that have been backed up through iCloud photo backup. Google has a similar service. This is an era, once again, when Apple's security wasn't that great. There was no two-factor authentication. It was quite easy to phish someone and get their account details. And what happened was 4chan started targeting celebrities and getting into their accounts and leaking any nude images that they found. And the problem with this isn't that the hack happened. That's a side effect. The actual real problem is that, oh my goodness, 5 minutes? Wow. Okay. I'll run through this. So the problem in this case is that Apple designed the system in which people opted into backing up without any real idea that what they were doing, right? Like, there's no way that anyone would ever back up photos of themselves, like intimate photos, to a server somewhere else. And peer-to-peer communities run this risk too. So, for example, there's an issue of decentralization and risk. Man, 5 minutes, I'm really screwed. I'm going to go over a little bit, I'm sorry. Yeah, that'll be enough. I apologize. I thought I had more time than I did. Peer-to-peer have these issues too. For example, someone took an example of they scraped LinkedIn for all of the US customs accounts that were people who worked there, and then essentially put them on GitHub. GitHub took them down because they thought it was too risky, and then someone put it up on a DAT share, and as a result of that, it got shared quite widely, and that's a really dangerous thing because legal risk is decentralized in a decentralized system, and there's no real way to protect yourself once you access that share. And so there's all of these ways in which normal people don't have the full idea of the consent. Normal, I mean like non-technical people, don't have the ability to understand these steps, and yet we've designed these systems. This is an infrastructure problem more than an interface problem, but the issues are the same. By designing these elegant solutions, we open up people to severe risk. The second one is team apathy and inertia. So this is where a team just looks at a best case example and goes, that's enough, that's what we're going to care about. The most common example of this is Facebook, which year after year puts an end-of-year celebratory message at the top of your Facebook timeline, if you've got a Facebook. But the problem with this is that, like, if you look at this image here, the girl on the left died of cancer in that year. Here's what your year looked like. Your daughter died. That's a photo of someone's mother's ashes. It's a person's apartment on fire, and the one on the left, bottom left, is a dog that had to be put down for old age. So this is an example where you have an algorithm that's building things, and then it's like there's an assumption that's made that everything is happy and that everything's great. So you have this like re-traumatization in lived experiences. And the man whose daughter in the top left, he was grieving at the time when he wrote this, but he's still kind of touched on it, which is basically like algorithms are essentially thoughtless. They model certain decision flows, but once you run them, no more thought occurs. To call a person thoughtless is usually considered a slight or an outright insult, and yet we unleash so many literally thoughtless processes on our users, on our lives, on ourselves. In creating the year in review app, there wasn't enough thought given to cases like mine or anyone who had a bad year. The design is for the ideal user, the happy, upbeat, good life user. It doesn't take other use cases into account. And again, this is the kind of thing that we, not just in centralized communities, we see it in decentralized communities too, where designing for the ideal or designing for what you think people are going to use your platform for is not always the best case, because people are going to use it for all sorts of reasons, especially if you nail it, especially if you do such a good job that people want to use it. Twitter's a really good example of that, but I'll skip that example. Although what I will do is I will show you the garbage fire with seagulls, which is a really good metaphor for Twitter. Thank you. The third one is conscious weaponization and persuasion, and I think this one is where I can actually breeze through as well and get to my proposals. And this is like really obvious. This is when like a design team actually works with other teams within an organization to really mess with people. So a great example is like Facebook, who earlier last year were like, we've redesigned the news feed to make it more engaging. And then of course 6 months later, the Justice Department was there figuring out whether Cambridge Analytica had used the news feed to really mess with people, right? And whether or not you think that that's like a real story or not, it doesn't really matter like how much of an impact you had. What matters is that like Facebook does this all the time, where the design teams collaborate with especially the social researchers inside the company, and they do really weird stuff like, let's show very engaged people. We've designed a system in which people are very engaged. We're pushing all of their addiction buttons. Now, let's serve sad people sad stuff and see if they remain sad. Like, the ethics of that is unreal. So I guess what I'm here to say is like, it's time that we, as a community, demand a better design, not just of ourselves, but of the people we work with as well, or people whose platforms we use. We need to start designing for different kinds of situations. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of these things. I'm going to blast through them, and I apologize. If you have any questions about any of this, please, or ideas especially, please come and talk to me after this. So the first one, of course, is designing for personas, politics, not personas. So the idea is that a user persona is where you break down users and their traits into like identifiable groups, and then you can, by doing this, you can design at scale, right? So you can say these are the types of users they have, and then you combine them with user stories, which are like little actions that users have or that they do in your system, and they're task-based. And then through those, you can not just communicate at scale within your team and get everyone on the same page, but you can break down that work and then design at scale. The problem with this is that when you start doing that work, you lose the interpersonal connection kind of stuff, right? The problem is that we're more than tasks, and we're more than people who are just the interpersonal intricacies of people. That lack of focus on individuals means that you're lost. By focusing on individuals and not communities, you have a real problem there. But luckily, people have done work on this. So if you look at massive multiplayer designers, people who design games around World of Warcraft, EVE Online, this is RuneScape, there's lots of different examples, but the core successes of them are that they produce participatory design, where it's not just about the interface or the game world or anything like that, but you also design for player-to-player interaction. And by doing that, you're starting to address issues that I think you can take those and put them into like designing a smart light bulb or something like that. Second idea that I think we should look at is designing for the worst case scenario. And this is something that I learned in my work at Spider Oak, which is that like different teams have different things. And the really good example of this is that like a security team is actually a form of product design, because while you are making the best possible product to keep people in, the security team is designing the worst possible UX to keep people out, right? So by doing this, and communicating and collaborating with each other, this particular engagement of where typically these two groups are like far away from each other, if that collaboration happens, then suddenly you have people who are doing things like threat modeling in your organization, or systems that allow you to communicate about some of the things you want to keep out. And in many cases, an InfoSec team or a security team has a really good understanding, because they have to deal with the fallout of the decisions that the engineering and design team makes through phishing and through brute force or actual hacking. You look at this in terms of things like passwordless systems as well, right? So this is examples of like sharing information and like getting rid of the vector for creating, for phishing people by removing passwords altogether. And that's like a synthesis of design and engineering and security research. And of course, like Apple's biometric stuff is a part of that too. Of course, this kind of work leads to really cool stuff like the web authentication framework that's coming to web browsers. And then the final thing I just want to talk about is confronting design outcomes. If you saw out the front as you came in, there's a code of conduct out the front. Like, code of conducts are a really big deal. In Silicon Valley, they start co-opting some of these ideas and turning them into like, we're an inclusive team, we have like good benefits, we really care about our employees, but I think that it's time that we start looking at outcomes. And perhaps alongside a code of conduct in an organization, especially places like open source communities, perhaps it's time to start looking at codes of outcomes where we actually brutally start confronting some of the unintended consequences of our work, right? And actually sitting down as groups and saying like, what is an acceptable outcome? And how can we identify what an acceptable outcome is? The issue is that when you talk about things like ethics in design or ethics in technology, it's very easy to consider yourself as ethical. Very few people operate unethically, deliberately, right? And so the issue isn't the process of like whether or not you're doing good or not, but rather the outcomes. It doesn't matter what you said, but like how the other person interpreted it, right? And that's really important in design. Wow, I just breezed through like a 40-minute lecture and I'm like, whew. So I just want to finish up with this one quote and then I'm done, which is that, this is from Donald Norman: when people fail to follow these bizarre secret rules and the machine does the wrong thing, its operators are blamed for not understanding the machine and not following its rigid specifications. With everyday objects, the result is frustration. With complex devices, the result leads to accidents, injuries, and death. It's time to reverse this situation. It is the duty of machines and those who design them to understand people, and it is not our duty to understand the arbitrary, meaningless dictates of the machine. I wrote an essay on this for Tactical Tech. There's a copy of it mirrored on my website. Take a moment to take a photo of that if you want to read it. And also check out Tactical Tech's other work. We're really trying to turn this into a bigger discussion. Oh, sorry, I had to breeze through that, but it's there on the website. Thank you very much. That's the most terrifying 5 minutes. Oh my God. Do we have time for questions? Have I taken too much? Okay. Okay, I'm relaxing. I got the key points, but there was more of a narrative, and it was more of a, yeah. Hang on, stop. Yep.
I'm wondering about parts of your critique and presentation and how it relates to modern agile methodologies, especially considering a sort of groupthink, frog in boiling water, ignorance of issues. Moment to moment, sprint to sprint. So the normalization of this becomes more easy and more crystallized.
There's a lot of, so the question is, what role does Agile play in this, right? And the answer is a big role, actually. A big part of what I described there even if you don't use a full agile system, agile is this idea of like regular reviews and sprints and things like that. And sprints being this idea where you divide work up into bite-sized tasks, you assign it all difficulty or like how long it will take, and then you then just like burn through these issues, burn through these features that you want to build. And the issue, of course, with that is that, as I mentioned before, it was one of the things that I jumped over actually because, but yeah, it's exactly right. Like when you start to break things down, the only way you can do that successfully is to like generify your users and generify the kinds of interactions that they have. And when you combine that with like this idea of like yearning for the cultural context being like ubiquitous, then you end up with this situation where like you just expect everybody's going to like a photo of their burning house on Facebook. Yep.
Question. Do you have any insights about the legislation implications that companies that provide these services could have? For example, like if you're mistreated in a local service, you can sue them against companies. But we don't have this currently.
Yeah.
Services and online, and also because they permeate the geographical location, so it's hard to target them. I was wondering if your research also touched upon that.
So the question is whether there's any sort of legal or regulatory things that we can do to like to hold people to account, hold companies to account. And the answer is kind of, and probably that will happen more. And the first half is kind of is GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is a flawed thing. I don't want to talk about the specifics of it because then I'll take up the rest of both days. But that thing goes towards addressing some of these issues, right? And it does so in key specific ways. The other thing with it, though, is that like one of the things that usually happens when we start talking about this is that we start comparing it to the idea of the transport safety authorities, right? Like the idea that there's a sort of, we're in this parallel to how aeronautics and engineering, like airplanes actually unfolded, which is that like early planes were visibly like crashing and things like that, and it was a really sort of shocking kind of set of circumstances, and through the politics of the day you end up with like a transit board and a highly regulated international set of agreements around how airlines work, right? And that's kind of like, I think we're in the beginning stages of that. I think we're still in the stage where like it would take 12 hours to fly from like Berlin to London or whatever, and the plane would disappear halfway there and no one would know where it went. We're kind of like in that space but right now where it's like outrageous issues around like either breaches of trust or like data breaches, things like that. The difference though is that it's moving a lot slower because when airplanes crash, it's like a really dramatic, visible event. When someone gets hacked, like the Equifax hack, credit reporting hack in the US, that'll take decades to actually play out. And so the scale of time, humans are not great at scale of time, and so we won't see the full effects. But then every once in a while, there's a big one like the iCloud photo hack, which like immediately snaps to people. The Ashley Madison hack is another example where people literally suicided over what they thought people would find in these data sets. Yeah.
How do you think we can, at this point in time, like improve the user experience of GDPR, where it is like, you know, like user facing? Like I mean, I understand. I'm actually a fan of GDPR, but like because some situation is not all about conveniences, right? It's about like someone telling you on your face there's something happening in the back.
Yeah.
But to be honest, I think after maybe the click, like cookie banner that I click accept, it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. I like just click it, and I think this is a very bad way of telling people there's something behind. Like, what do you think? How can we improve this?
Burn all the cookies. Like the real issue is not that like it's a GDPR fights against a certain kind of set of behaviors on the web, right? The first round, the cookie banner that you're talking about, was like the EU sort of naively stepping into something and not really considering the actual consequence, which was like everything just has a cookie banner and you go away. The GDPR, on the other hand, you can actually comply with it completely and not have to show anything if you comply with it exactly, right? And there are ways of doing that. The reason why we see GDPR banners on everything is because people are being like, well, you want me to like be transparent? Fine. And they just like put a giant sheet of interface in front of you. It's all about the implementation in that case. There are definitely ways in which you could design a system and be fully GDPR compliant, but of course it hurts business cases. So that's why you get things like Tumblr, for example, which decided they would list every single one of the 500 ad companies that they were partnered with, however many it was in the hundreds, and you would have to go through and individually uncheck every single one. You couldn't, like, when it first launched, you couldn't just like turn it on or off. You had to do it one by one. And so it's important to note that this is a problem where designers, that's a dark UX pattern, like the idea of like interrupting a user so you can like tell them all about the ways in which you're tracking them is a dark UX pattern. Yeah, at the back.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question that's sort of speculative. So in your presentation, you pointed out a number of really interesting points about how behaviors are incentivized. And it seems to me like I've been witnessing a further pushing of responsibility up the upstream. So it's not necessarily the responsibility of consumers to always be well informed. Now it's about UX and how design implements there. I'm wondering where you think the next step upstream is and how we might start to change values and behaviors there so that before businesses are incentivized with hundreds of thousands every month for developing bad apps that are harming people, how can we educate, or what is the next step upstream for intervention?
I actually think that so the question is, who's ultimately responsible? Like, how do we move the burden of responsibility from consumers to design teams? Where does it go next from there? And the answer is actually, I think, education. I think that what we need to do is take stuff like this, and I'm not the only person sort of talking about this. There's a few others that are like really meaningful in this space. But the idea is like, and much more eloquent than me, that's for sure. But like, the idea is that like, we need to get into schools and we need to have like working examples of this stuff already existing. For example, in criticisms that in back and forths I've had, which have been wholly friendly, like I'm not suggesting that there's any sort of issue here, but like one of the things that frustrates me when I engage in the peer-to-peer space and start talking about this is everyone says, well, discoverability is really hard and like security is really hard and all this kind of stuff. But the problem is that like the idea of private, like decentralized spaces, there's like a handful of people working on them. If everybody in this room who was an engineer who was working on like a protocol actually like cared about the discoverability and privacy side of things as much as everything else, would we be further along with this kind of stuff? Who knows? But it starts with like the education and sort of getting people to understand as part of their discipline why this is important and what those responsibilities are, because then I think that's when people start to care about that. I don't think it's enough to say like politically we're into the ways in which we can provide an alternate future without fully considering those. And the problem is that privacy is as hard as the other areas. As an example, privacy is an example, but like the idea of privacy and consent is so difficult, and there's so few people working on it and so many assumptions that people make when we're designing these things that, yeah, I just think that that's where it starts, is like education and making it like really a faux pas over the course of the next 15 years for people to be designing like these kind of ways by default. Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.